Something inside me just snapped, and the wildest part is that nobody in the entire Rick Ross camp has the guts to admit it out loud on camera. For 2 straight decades, the man calling himself the biggest boss in hip-hop was selling you a Miami-sized fairy tale wrapped in gold foil. Private jets. Emerald chains thick enough to anchor a yacht in international waters. A mansion so cartoonishly enormous that Rick Ross once bragged he mowed the entire lawn himself, just because he could, just because the flex of pushing a lawnmower across an estate that size was itself a punchline. Rick Ross was not just a rapper. Rick Ross was engineered as a monument, sculpted brick by brick over 20 years of interviews, magazine covers, and hook after hook. And monuments, ladies and gentlemen, are not designed to crack in public in front of millions of phone cameras. Yet here we sit, in the ugliest week of Rick Ross's entire career, watching that monument shed chunks of marble in real time. One clip after another. One photograph after another. One receipt after another. What you are about to witness is not a rap beef. Not a diss track. Not a simple industry disagreement. This is the slow-motion demolition of the biggest boss persona hip-hop has ever manufactured. And before the credits roll on this breakdown, you will understand exactly why Rick Ross may never fully claw his way back from what just happened to him in the span of a single news cycle. Welcome back to the channel, family. If you like your rap forensics served without the filter and without the sugarcoating, tap that subscribe button, smash the like, and lock in with me for the next 20 minutes. Because the deeper we drop into this rosy reality distortion field, the wilder the picture gets and the harder the pieces snap into place. And trust me on this one, we are going all the way to the bottom floor of this thing. No exits. No stopping. Let us begin with the exact moment the mask actually slipped off Rick Ross's face on live television. A journalist casually mentioned to Rick Ross that a quick internet search puts his personal net worth at $150 million. A simple statement. A number Rick Ross himself has quietly ridden on for years. A number Rick Ross has never once corrected in any interview. Instead of a clean confirmation, instead of a proud yes, instead of the swaggering nod you would expect from a man who literally invented the modern boss archetype in rap, Rick Ross laughed it off with a lazy little punchline. Something breezy. Something dismissive. Something that landed like a man dodging a receipt he could not physically produce on demand. In any other year of Rick Ross's career, that non-answer would have played as pure swagger, as untouchable confidence. In this year, in this climate, on this internet, Rick Ross came off like a man caught with his hand halfway inside the cookie jar and no explanation ready. And the clip is now everywhere on every platform. Because the second Rick Ross gave that answer, the audience clocked something deeply uncomfortable in the atmosphere. The biggest boss in the room suddenly did not want to talk about the money at all. And when a man who built his entire persona on the money suddenly refuses to talk about the money, you pay very close attention to what happens next. Because this is not one scandal, not one lawsuit, not one bad interview, not one awkward quote taken out of context. What is unfolding around Rick Ross right now is a slow drip. A leak inside the ceiling that keeps growing every time you look up. Each embarrassment small enough to shrug off on its own, but stacked together into a wave nobody in his inner orbit can hold back at this point. Fake diamond accusations. Fake watch accusations. Cheap crystal ice on chains that reportedly sparkle a little too orange under the studio lights. A jeweler community that now openly cracks jokes at Rick Ross's expense on their own platforms. A commercial flight photo that detonated an entire 20-year mythology in under 6 hours. Half-priced concert tickets showing up on discount sites. Rows of unsold seats leaking from tour photos. A cancelled album cycle. A former close friend and collaborator who is now his loudest enemy on every timeline. And underneath all of it, the ghost of a corrections officer uniform that Rick Ross spent 20 long years actively pretending never existed at all. You want to know how ugly this has actually gotten for Rick Ross right now? Let us walk it step by step, receipt by receipt, moment by moment. Because if you thought this was just a rough week for the boss, you have not been paying attention to the full pattern. Grab a seat. This is where the picture snaps into focus. Start with the jewelry. For years, Rick Ross flexed a wrist that looked like a private museum on tour. Emerald-encrusted timepieces. Cuban links thicker than a grown man's forearm. Rings that could double as speed bumps in a residential parking lot. And for a long stretch of that career, the entire industry played along, because when Rick Ross walked into any room, the assumption was simple and unchallenged. Everything on Rick Ross is real. Everything on Rick Ross is paid for in cash. Everything on Rick Ross is boss. Then one jeweler, one very specific jeweler with a reputation that actually matters in this space, decided to open his mouth on camera in front of a rolling lens. He said flat out that a particular watch on Rick Ross's wrist was fake. Not overpriced. Not aftermarket. Fake. He explained that this exact model was only ever produced twice in history, one in a 37mm case and one in a 41mm case. He said he personally knew both real owners on a first-name basis. And neither one of those two real owners was the rapper from Miami. That is not a hater. That is not an internet troll running a burner account. That is a paternity test performed on live camera in front of the whole world. And here is the thing about accusations that's specific. They are too surgical to shrug off with a laugh. Rick Ross could laugh at a random critic. Rick Ross could dismiss a jealous hater in a comment section. But a working jeweler dropping serial number level detail on live camera is a completely different weapon entirely. Because now every photo Rick Ross has ever posted, every red carpet close-up, every studio shot of that famous wrist over the last decade becomes evidence in a trial he never signed up to stand in. Rick Ross tried to sweat it away with a joke of his own. Rick Ross claimed he had personally spoken to every jeweler in Miami who deals in fake diamonds, and that the piece on his wrist was actually a legitimate high-end model loaded with green emeralds, and that the whole thing was just Rick Ross having fun at the culture's expense. Cute answer. Weak answer. Because the internet does not care about vibes anymore. The internet cares about receipts and only receipts. And the receipts right now are not landing on Rick Ross's side of the courtroom. Now stack the flight photo on top of that entire jewelry mess. This is the moment the dam actually broke in half. Rick Ross was photographed standing at an airport gate somewhere in the country. Hoodie pulled up over his head. Boarding a commercial flight like anybody else stuck in Group 4 with a middle seat waiting. Not a private terminal. Not a hangar. Not a chartered runway with a red carpet. A regular gate with regular passengers. And the internet lost its entire collective mind inside of an hour. Because Rick Ross is the man who has been telling us for 20 solid years that he only flies private jets across every zip code. Rick Ross is the man who once claimed he made himself a personal promise decades ago that he would never charter a jet until the day he could buy one outright in cash. Rick Ross is the man who framed his private jet purchase as a career investment. A milestone. A monument to 20-plus years of hustle and grind. So when the biggest boss in hip-hop showed up in a boarding line with the rest of us regular people, the entire mythology cracked in real time in front of a million recording phones. Rick Ross tried to explain the situation away. Rick Ross said the private jet was being upgraded with a high-end connectivity system for onboard use. Rick Ross said he chose to fly commercial that day to Colombia to party with his old friend Trick Daddy. Rick Ross joked that when he was back on six-figure flights next week, he was popping bottles all over again. On paper, that explanation is completely reasonable. Planes get serviced constantly in this business. Millionaires take commercial flights constantly when their jets are grounded for maintenance. But that is precisely the trap Rick Ross built for himself over 2 decades. When your entire brand is limitless excess and untouchable elevation, a reasonable explanation lands like a full confession under oath. Because a monument was never supposed to have reasonable moments. A monument is supposed to be a myth. And myths, family, do not board Group 4. That is the trap of a persona built entirely on excess and elevation. It has to stay flawless from the outside every single day. The second it slips even slightly, the audience treats the slip as the real story and the years of consistency as the performance. And right now, Rick Ross is caught inside that exact trap with no clear exit. Rick Ross is not just a rapper anymore. Rick Ross is a defendant in the court of public perception with the entire internet on the jury. and the internet has already reached a preliminary verdict before the trial has even ended. Then came the comedians circling with their microphones out. Uncle Murda took his shot at the perfect timing. Uncle Murda cracked that the Miami rapper looked so depressed to be flying with, and I quote, "You junkies." Rick Ross fired back, joking that Uncle Murda had never really killed anything memorable in his career, and offered Uncle Murda and his kids a free teeth cleaning as a favor. A jab at Uncle Murda's famous smile. On any other week in Rick Ross's timeline, that exchange is harmless trash talk between two veterans in the same industry. But on this particular week, stacked against every other embarrassment closing in on Rick Ross from every angle at once, it lands with the weight of a piano falling out of a 15th-story window straight onto concrete. But you know who did not need this particular week to launch his shots at Rick Ross? DMX. Years ago, when a room full of people asked DMX to name the rappers who actually impressed him at all, DMX went completely quiet for a beat. Then DMX pivoted to the Maybach Music founder with a dismissive little shrug of the shoulders. DMX said Rick Ross was all right. Just all right. But DMX quickly added that all Rick Ross ever really rapped about on any record was eating and smoking. DMX asked, at some point in a career, how much food can you actually eat before it stops being interesting? How much weed can you actually smoke before it stops being a personality trait? How many Maybachs does one grown man actually need in a driveway? The clip has been floating in the archive for years, buried under a decade of Rick Ross's commercial dominance. But the second the image cracked in public, that DMX clip came sprinting back onto every feed with fresh interpretation. And this time it stuck to the wall. Because the DMX critique is not really a diss track. The DMX critique is a diagnosis from a doctor with a stethoscope. It is the argument that beneath the voice, beneath the aura, beneath the mansion shots, there was never actually that much content there to begin with. For 20 years straight, Rick Ross's commercial success drowned that critique out under a wave of platinum plaques. Now, with the Rick Ross image itself under active fire, the DMX critique is enjoying a violent and unforgiving second life. And Rick Ross has absolutely no way to unring that particular bell. Then there is the stage name itself. The stage name Rick Ross was borrowed from real life. Freeway Ricky Ross, the real-life figure whose story predates the rapper by many years, has always claimed openly that the Miami rapper lifted his name and elements of his public image without permission or compensation. Freeway Ricky Ross said on camera that whenever he shows up somewhere in public, Rick Ross tends to vanish from the same room within minutes. The dispute eventually escalated into a full copyright lawsuit filed back in 2010. A strange, mostly forgotten footnote for casual Rick Ross fans. But that footnote turns out to be crucial to this whole situation. Because when the mask starts slipping in real time, everybody in the audience reaches back into the archive for context. And the archive on Rick Ross is loaded with landmines that were quietly waiting to be triggered. You know what else is buried in that archive? The corrections officer photograph. The one Rick Ross spent years actively denying to journalists. When reporters first asked Rick Ross about it back in 2008, his answer was a flat no with no hesitation. Rick Ross said, "That is not true, that is not me, move on." Then a photograph surfaced. A 19-year-old William Roberts smiling in a full corrections officer uniform. Timestamped. Undeniable. Verified. No lyric, no diss track, no crafted interview response could have done what that single photograph did to Rick Ross's carefully built origin story. Because that photograph turned an accusation into an artifact. And artifacts do not simply disappear from history, no matter how many hits you drop. Fast forward to right now, and Rick Ross tells a softer, self-deprecating version of that whole story. Rick Ross confirms he was a corrections officer. Rick Ross says it happened when he was around 20 years old and directionless. Rick Ross claims he barely made it through the training program itself, maybe 4 short months at most before he was let go for chronic tardiness and lack of interest. Cute story. Almost charming. Almost redemptive. Only one problem with the story. The paperwork disagrees with the entire timeline. Public employment records reportedly show that William Roberts worked as a corrections officer in Miami-Dade County for closer to 18 months, not 4. Records show Rick Ross was formally hired in December of 1995 and officially resigned in June of 1997. Records show a solid attendance history throughout that entire employment period. Records show an annual salary of roughly $26,000 per year. So the story Rick Ross tells and the paper trail behind Rick Ross do not match anywhere close to each other. And once you notice that one story does not match the paper trail on record, you start wondering how many other Rick Ross stories might not match either. Now roll all of that forward into the biggest fracture of them all. Because this next section, the section that ties every single piece of this puzzle together into one clean picture, is the actual reason this whole Rick Ross story is exploding right now on every platform simultaneously. And that reason has a name. A very familiar name. That name is Drake. For 15 straight years, Rick Ross and Drake were one of the most reliable pairings in modern hip-hop history. Not just featured on each other's songs occasionally. Not just chart partners of convenience. Actual friends who trusted each other. Rick Ross said publicly in interview after interview that out of every rapper alive on Earth today, Drake was his personal favorite artist to work with inside a studio booth. The two of them talked openly on record about doing a full-length joint album together someday. It even had a working title that leaked to the press. Wallow. Fans have been asking about that record for years across social media. It never came out. It probably never will. And in hindsight, it never coming is its own quiet tragedy stitched into the middle of this entire Rick Ross saga. Because the biggest streaming song of Rick Ross's entire career, the only Rick Ross song to ever crack 1 billion Spotify plays on the platform, is a Drake collaboration. Money in the Grave. Stack that fact up against Aston Martin music. Stack that up against Stay Schemin'. Stack that up against the DJ Khaled anchor records that dominated summers for years. And the pattern becomes impossible to ignore for anyone looking closely. Rick Ross's biggest commercial peaks are not Rick Ross solo peaks at all. Rick Ross's biggest peaks in the streaming era are Drake peaks with Rick Ross features attached. That is the specific fact that makes this next part so unbelievably brutal. Because in early 2024, Rick Ross made a decision that changed everything permanently. Rick Ross picked a side in the biggest rap war of the modern era. Rick Ross climbed onto a Future and Metro Boomin album called We Don't Trust You, appearing on the track Everyday Hustle with an aggressive verse. That same album carried the Kendrick Lamar verse on the song Like That, the verse that lit the modern rap war on fire in the first place. Then Rick Ross went public with his open, undeniable support for Kendrick's diss track campaign. Then Rick Ross unfollowed Drake on social media in front of everyone. A tiny click. A quiet gesture. A single button press, and an unmistakable declaration that 15 years of partnership had just been formally torn up in front of the entire industry and every fan base watching. Drake did not stay quiet for long after that betrayal. On push-ups, Drake pointed at Rick Ross's age directly, then dropped a line that stung harder than any traditional insult ever could. Because it was not really an insult at all. It was a documented fact. Drake pointed out on record that a huge chunk of the Miami rapper's biggest Billboard hits, songs like I'm on One, Money in the Grave, and Lemon Pepper Freestyle, all had one common ingredient stitched into the DNA. Drake. That is not shade. That is a receipt printed in stereo sound and pressed onto vinyl. Drake also referenced Tia Kemp on record, the mother of one of Rick Ross's sons. And around exactly the same time as the Push-Ups release, Tia Kemp launched a podcast run of her own that lit up the entire internet with fresh, unfiltered material about her time with Rick Ross. Drake even joked playfully on his own channels that Tia Kemp was his personal GOAT. And in the middle of all that noise, right after the unfollow, Rick Ross's former partner Christina Mackey posted photographs of VIP tickets and front row seats to a sold-out Drake concert. Timing that everybody noticed. Nobody said out loud what everybody was already thinking. But everybody was thinking it in unison. Rick Ross swung back with champagne moments, complete with a full music video treatment and cinematic production. Rick Ross revived the ghostwriter narrative that has haunted Drake for over a decade of his career. Rick Ross sampled Drake's own recorded voice for the outro of the song. Rick Ross roasted Drake's physical appearance across multiple bars. Rick Ross posted memes accusing Drake of cosmetic surgery, a nose job, edited abs, texting Rick Ross with excuses over private message. Rick Ross posted what he claimed were private text messages between them for public consumption. Drake fired back that Rick Ross had gone loopy from not eating properly, that Rick Ross was performing at high school proms for a paycheck now, and that Rick Ross was now, in Drake's own phrase, one nosy goof. That last line hurt worse than the others because it framed Rick Ross as small. And small was the one thing Rick Ross was never supposed to be under any circumstances. Then Drake did the one thing that made this feud radically different from every other rap feud in living memory. Drake attacked the real estate directly. Drake implied on record that the land underneath the famous Miami mansion was not fully owned by Rick Ross at all. Drake called the whole property the Miami Starter Pack in front of millions of listeners. That is the exact moment the beef stopped being about music entirely. Because the second Drake dragged the lifestyle itself into the fight, Drake was no longer just dissing a rapper on a track. Drake was attacking the myth beneath the man. And Rick Ross's whole brand is the myth. Rick Ross's whole product for sale is the fantasy of the biggest boss lifestyle. When Drake mocked that estate on the record, Drake was not throwing a punch at a song. Drake was throwing a punch at the marketing department. And the marketing department is the entire company operating behind Rick Ross's name. Then came Vancouver, July of 2024. A date that will live in Rick Ross infamy for a very long time. The Miami rapper performed at Ignite Music Festival in front of a Canadian crowd. And to cap his set that night, Rick Ross's own DJ played Kendrick Lamar's Not Like Us inside Drake's home country in front of Drake's home fans. That single decision detonated a chain reaction inside the venue. Fights broke out near the stage almost immediately. Security dragging bodies off the concrete. Video circulating within minutes across every platform on Earth. Millions of views before the sun even came up over the city that morning. One of Rick Ross's own associates knocked completely unconscious in the chaos. And when Rick Ross was asked about it afterward by a reporter, all Rick Ross said was that security had told him he probably should not have been there in the first place. That was the entire quote for the record. That was the entire debrief from a man whose entire brand is built on being untouchable and unbothered in any environment. Security told him he should not have been there. Drake did not let that Vancouver moment die on the internet. Drake later referenced the Vancouver incident inside a bar that layered 3 separate meanings on top of each other, like a stack of pancakes. Drake wrapped the reference inside a TLC callback with surgical precision. Meaning 1, the wrestling event where fighters get put through wooden tables. Meaning 2, the R&B group with members named Chili, Left Eye, and T-Boz. Meaning 3, tender loving care in the classic sense. The line pointed directly at the fact that the biggest boss got hit on the left side of his face after playing Not Like Us in Drake's own city. 3 punchlines wrapped inside a single delivered line. That is the kind of bar that stops a career on impact and makes the room go silent. And Drake casually dropped it in the middle of a verse like it was nothing at all. Stop. Rewind. Catch that. Meanwhile, 50 Cent was circling overhead the entire time with binoculars. 50 Cent has been recycling the corrections officer photograph, the ex-girlfriend accusations, and the pig iron jokes for well over a decade now without stopping. 50 Cent does not need new material for Rick Ross. 50 Cent just needs to keep the old material breathing on Instagram at strategic intervals. And in 2026, 50 Cent dropped a Diddy documentary that dominated streaming charts for weeks on end. While riding that new wave of cultural attention, 50 Cent piled on Rick Ross over the Vancouver footage nonstop. 50 Cent posted Tia Kemp clips repeatedly and laughed loudly at every one of them. When Rick Ross was asked directly in a recent interview whether he and 50 Cent were ever cool at any point in their careers, Rick Ross said no. Not since day one. Not for a single day. Then Rick Ross tried to pivot into offense, joking about 50 Cent's fashion sense before throwing a real shot with actual weight behind it. Rick Ross said 50 Cent does not own his own masters to this day. Rick Ross said Eminem and Dr. Dre essentially rescued 50 Cent's entire career from the ground up. And Rick Ross said the Miami rapper built his own empire from slip and slide up with nobody handing him anything on a plate. And then Rick Ross casually mentioned that 50 Cent apparently lives in a 2-bedroom apartment somewhere. Cute bar. But 50 Cent has been living rent-free inside Rick Ross's head for so long now that a 2-bedroom crack barely registered on the scoreboard at all. It looked more like desperation than dominance. Then the emergency landing happened. And this is where the universe started writing satire on Rick Ross's behalf. Days after Rick Ross posted a video telling Drake to be safe on his old jet, joking that Drake's plane was a 1978 cargo model gifted to Drake for promotional reasons only, Rick Ross's own private jet made an emergency landing in Dallas. Everybody on board survived the incident, thankfully. But the photographs raced across the internet inside minutes of touchdown. And Drake allegedly was spotted liking a post about the incident within the same hour. Rick Ross tried to laugh it off publicly, joking that Drake's fighter jets had shot him down out of the sky. It did not work at all. The joke about Drake's jet had aged into a piece of prophecy against Rick Ross's own name. And the internet does not forgive prophecy that fires backwards at the person who fired it first. You want to know what the biggest actual sign of trouble looks like for Rick Ross right now? It is not any single one of these moments in isolation from the others. It is the tour numbers. The Port of Miami 20th anniversary run was being promoted heavily across every platform, and the photographs started leaking from inside the venues. Rows of empty seats stretching to the back of the arena. Buy one get 150% off ticket deals showing up on discount sites. Discounts that ordinarily do not touch an artist of Rick Ross's assumed stature in this industry. When Drake reacted online to the tour footage, allegedly, the internet piled on all over again in unison. Then came flight tracking data that reportedly showed Rick Ross's private jet had been sitting inactive on the ground for weeks before the commercial flight photograph was even taken. And while nothing was ever officially confirmed by Rick Ross himself, the timing detonated the theories anyway across every hip-hop forum on the internet. Then, in perfect narrative timing that felt almost scripted by fate, Drake dropped a music video filmed right next to his own private jet on a runway. Cinematic. Deliberate. Framed with intention. A calculated visual reply that did not need a single lyric to make its point stick. And in the middle of all of this collapsing simultaneously, Rick Ross's long-awaited solo album, Set in Stone, got pushed back on the release calendar without a firm new date. Rick Ross posted a caption defending the delay. Iceman melted. Stone lasts eternity. Great line for a graphic. Weak timing for a reality check. Because if Stone truly lasts eternity as promised, then why does the release date keep shifting sideways every few weeks on the calendar? A lot of Rick Ross fans argued the delay was smart business strategy in a crowded release window. That may even be true from a purely commercial standpoint. But smart business is not the story people are telling right now on the timelines that matter. The story people are telling right now is that Rick Ross is out of ammunition entirely. And when you have spent 20 years selling the world the fantasy of unlimited ammunition in the chamber, running out is the one single thing you are never allowed to do in front of the audience. Now, before we push another inch further into this deconstruction, let me be extremely clear about one thing. Calling Rick Ross broke in the literal financial sense would be a genuine stretch of the truth. Rick Ross has built out multiple Wingstop franchises over the years. Rick Ross has real estate holdings across several states. Rick Ross has ventures, partnerships, endorsements across multiple industries. Rick Ross has told interviewers on record repeatedly that he runs at least 25 different ventures under different LLC names. Rick Ross has said he flies to Dubai one week and Canada the next week without breaking a sweat. Rick Ross has said publicly that a single strip club performance appearance can cover a full year of his personal expenses. On any accountant's spreadsheet, Rick Ross is fine. Rick Ross is more than fine on paper. But that is exactly the point of this entire breakdown. This whole story was never really about the spreadsheet at all. This story was always about the perception in the culture. Because the biggest boss did not sell you a spreadsheet full of numbers. The biggest boss sold you a legend written in gold. And legends do not survive on paperwork inside a filing cabinet. Legends survive on belief in the hearts of the audience. And belief, family, once cracked in public, is almost impossible to weld back together with tape and a press release from a publicist. That is why every explanation Rick Ross offers right now sounds louder than it should sound. The Wi-Fi upgrade on the private jet. The Colombia trip to see Trick Daddy for old times. The tour discount reframed as clever promotion. The album delay reframed as strategic patience. Any one of those explanations on its own is completely believable at face value. All of them landing together in the same news cycle feels like a man rearranging deck chairs on a ship that is already starting to visibly tilt to one side. Rick Ross could pull up a full bank statement tomorrow morning on live camera. Rick Ross could show every single account balance in high-definition detail. And it still would not fully close this narrative in the audience's mind. Because the story is no longer about the money at all. The story is about whether the audience still believes the man who told them the story in the first place. And that is the deepest cut of this entire situation for Rick Ross. This is not a beef Rick Ross lost on a scoreboard. This is a mythology Rick Ross can no longer defend from attackers. Because the myth of the biggest boss was never really the mansion or the jet or the emeralds by themselves. The myth was that none of it could ever be questioned by anyone alive. Once the questions begin in earnest, the myth begins to leak from the seams. And a leaking myth is not a myth anymore in the culture's memory. It is just a story people used to tell around campfires before someone found out the truth behind it. Now stack it all together one more time in one final sequence. Because this is the picture the internet is staring at right now with popcorn ready. Fake watch accusations. Fake diamond jokes. A 2-decade-old corrections officer chapter with a paper trail that contradicts Rick Ross's own official version of events. A borrowed name still contested in the courtroom of public opinion. A ghostwriter narrative that will not die no matter how many songs get released. A hometown DMX critique now aging into prophecy after his passing. A friendship with Drake incinerated on live television in slow motion. A live physical altercation in Vancouver caught on multiple angles. A public real estate mocking from the biggest streaming artist on the planet by every metric available. A jet that stopped moving on the flight tracker for weeks. A tour openly cutting prices to fill seats. An album pushed back on the calendar without explanation. A commercial flight photograph turned into a nationwide meme within hours. A 50-cent piling on with a decade of stored ammunition already loaded. A Tia Kemp podcast tour dropping fresh receipts weekly like a subscription service. A Christina Mackey Drake concert appearance timed to the second for maximum damage. Every single one of those items on its own is completely survivable for a man of Rick Ross's stature. 10 of them arriving inside the same news cycle are not survivable under any circumstances. So, where does this leave the Miami legend now? Financially, probably completely fine for years to come. Publicly, in the deepest hole of his entire career by a wide margin. Rick Ross is now visibly operating in damage control mode across every appearance. And you can hear it in every single interview clip that drops. The tone has shifted noticeably. The swagger is more careful, more measured, more defensive. The jokes arrive preloaded before the questions are even finished. The explanations show up faster than the accusations themselves in real time. That is not the sound of the biggest boss speaking. That is the sound of a man managing a crisis in slow motion under a spotlight. And the audience can feel that difference in the room even when they cannot articulate it out loud in a comment section. That is why the memes are not stopping across platforms. That is why the clips are not aging out of relevance. That is why every new public appearance from Rick Ross is now processed by the internet as evidence in a trial rather than entertainment for a Friday night. The final question in this entire breakdown is not whether Rick Ross is broke financially. The final question is whether the biggest boss persona itself can ever come back to life in the culture. And the honest answer, family, is that once cracks like this start showing across a persona in public view, no amount of clarification stitches them all the way shut again. Rick Ross could win a Grammy tomorrow night on the red carpet. Rick Ross could drop a classic solo album next month that critics love. And a piece of this cycle would still live inside the archive forever with a permalink. Because the internet has already decided which story it wants to tell about Rick Ross moving forward. The story is that Rick Ross the myth finally collided head-on with Rick Ross the man behind the myth. And the man could not carry the weight of the myth anymore on his own two shoulders. So here is the real ending of this whole thing. Rick Ross has spent 20 full years telling the world with a straight face that he is a monument built to last. This month, the monument stumbled in public view with cameras rolling. The world watched the monument stumble in slow motion. And the world will remember exactly what it saw for a long time. Rick Ross may not be broke at all. But the fantasy of the biggest boss, the fantasy that made every hook land harder, every mansion shot glow brighter, every emerald sparkle a little louder under the studio lights, that specific fantasy is no longer what it used to be in the culture. And if Rick Ross wants that fantasy back on the shelf, Rick Ross is going to have to rebuild it from scratch inside a version of the internet that no longer forgives its own myths for slipping in public. So, what do you actually think about all of this, family? Is Rick Ross going through a rough patch that quietly fades in 6 months when the news cycle moves on, or is this the permanent dent in the armor that the biggest boss persona never fully comes back from? Drop your verdict in the comments below without holding back. Because I am reading every single one of them personally. And the next breakdown on the next name is already dropping faster than you think. If you made it this far into the story with me, you are already ahead of the entire curve. So smash that like button one more time. Tap subscribe if you have not already. Turn on notifications so the algorithm knows to serve you the next chapter of this saga the second it breaks in real time. And if you want to know why the next name on the list is already trembling in his own boots waiting for his turn, the next video is waiting for you on your screen right now. Do not blink. Do not scroll past it. Tap the one calling your name. Because trust me on this. The next story is somehow even worse than this one. And you are not going to want to miss a single second of it.